Here's a couple of words you might find useful in the study of human metabolism. They also happen to be two words that I enjoy in general. Brunch, buffet. I'd throw in all you can eat, but that's kind of implied, and then it would be 6 words unless you hyphenate them. But still, brunch buffet. You got eggs and bacon and French toast and biscuits and fruit and some kind of weird sorted jello thing in there. And once you've paid your $12.99, you know there's a pretty good chance that it's all gonna get eaten. But here's the thing. Not everything that you fit into your face during brunch time is going to be handled the same way by your body. After you're done digesting, some nutrients will go straight to your body's pile of stuff to burn right away, but others will have to be converted into something else. For example, the carbs and fats in your buttered toast can be directly oxidized into usable energy, but the amino acids in the bacon have to be converted into molecules that get broken down like carbs if you want to get energy out of them. And while excess carbs and fats can be stored in larger polymer versions of their original forms, any extra amino acids can't be. They have to be converted and then stored as fat or glycogen. So as I've mentioned before, the molecules in your body are constantly changing shape and renewing and rearranging themselves to either build things or to use energy. And eating food replenishes these nutrients, especially glucose. Then, depending on what your body needs and when you last ate, certain hormones like insulin will help decide what to burn and what to store for later. This, of course, is an important function, which is why things can go badly if this process doesn't work properly because of a metabolic disorder like diabetes. In that case, your body can't properly use and store nutritional energy, which makes the very acts of eating and metabolizing more difficult and possibly dangerous. Exactly how glucose levels can spike or plummet, how we convert nutrients into energy, and how all of that relates to eating and hunger and weight, metabolism, and your health in general is, guess what? Complicated. But as you are a living thing that must eat in order to stay alive, I'd say it's worth learning how it works. And brunch is as good a place to start as any. Waiting in line for the all-you-can-eat brunch buffet is a good time to recall the law of conservation of energy. The law simply states that energy can never be created or destroyed, it can only change forms. And the process of metabolism involves conversions of energy, either through catabolizing reactions that release the energy stored in your food, or anabolizing ones that use or store that energy. So, you can enjoy your short stack of flapjacks and biscuits and gravy, but remember, that energy has to either get released or stored somewhere inside you. Now, the conversion of food energy is part of the great balancing act that is maintaining homeostasis, and one of its greatest tricks is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is how we derive energy from the food we eat, specifically glucose, which is where most of our food ends up. In order for glucose to become energy we can use, we have to give it some oxygen and convert each sugar molecule into 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water, which usually produces about 32 molecules of ATP. Cellular respiration occurs in 3 simultaneous phases where glucose is broken down by glycolysis and other catabolic reactions, and then turned into pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA, and finally ushered into the Krebs cycle. It's all pretty complicated, but we covered it extensively in Crash Course Biology, so rather than getting into the blow-by-blow here, I recommend you check out that video for a refresher. For now, just remember that cellular respiration breaks down nutrient molecules to generate ATP, and in doing so, it captures some of the chemical energy that was in those bonds for use in your body. Now, when it comes to how that energy is converted and where, that depends largely on when you ate your last meal. We all switch back and forth between 2 nutritional states, the absorptive or fed state, which is during or after eating, and the post-absorptive or fasting state, when the GI tract is empty and the body is running off of stored supplies. So say you're just post-brunch buffet and you're still in the absorptive state, unbuckling your belt as your digestive system breaks up the eggs and bacon and French toast and syrup into a bunch of mostly glucose molecules that pass into your bloodstream. The first bit of glucose gets delivered throughout the body and is tapped to generate ATP on the spot through cellular respiration. But since the meal was big and rich, there's more glucose floating around than your cells need at the moment. And remember, ATP is too unstable to be used for storage, which means all the extra glucose is going to get stored as fat or glycogen. And that storage is part of how you can end up gaining weight, because how much energy gets stored depends partly on your basal metabolic rate. That's the number of daily calories your body needs to do business as usual. And that rate can be influenced by your age, your sex, and body size or composition. A young bodybuilder is going to burn way more calories than that tiny grandma, but generally, if you're absorbing more nutrients than you're burning, you will gain weight. So yeah, for that, you can blame the law of conservation of energy. Now, of course, all nutrients are important. I mean, your body is basically made of protein, so that's kinda key. But in terms of immediate fuel, glucose is the easiest source of food for cells like your neurons, and it is always a good policy to keep your brain well fed so it doesn't get hangry or instead. So your body likes to maintain a blood glucose level of 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. But let's say that thanks to the buffet, you've now got 140 milligrams per deciliter. This means too much sugar is swimming around in your blood, and your body isn't happy about it. If your blood sugar levels get too high, it can damage blood vessels, especially those in the nervous system, heart, kidneys, eyes, and extremities. That's why diabetes is often associated with a higher risk of heart and kidney disease, loss of vision, and foot amputation. But typically, rising blood sugar levels sets off a series of events that trim them back down. Specifically, they trigger special beta cells in the pancreas to start secreting more of the hormone that regulates everything that happens when you're in the absorptive state. And this hormone is the all-powerful insulin. Insulin's job in this instance is to move glucose out of the blood and into storage, and to do that, it triggers a shift from catabolic reactions to anabolic ones. For example, it puts a stop to glycogenolysis, or breaking down glycogen in your liver and muscles to release glucose for energy, and instead ramps up the process of glycogenesis, where extra glucose is linked together to form glycogen. It also activates lipogenesis, where very cool chemical reactions in the liver convert glucose to triglycerides and then ship them off to your adipose tissue for storage. A similar thing happens with the extra fatty acids that you got from the eggs and bacon that aren't immediately needed for energy. They get processed through lipogenesis too and are rebuilt back into triglycerides and then tucked away for a rainy day. The thing is, if you're thinking about this, all these lipids hate water, right? Fat and water don't mix. So you should be asking yourself, how can they be transported in the blood when they're so hydrophobic? The answer is lipoproteins, 4 specialized proteins made by the liver that surround fats and allow them to move in the bloodstream as an emulsion. You've probably heard of some of these. One is low-density lipoprotein, also known as LDL cholesterol. It's what delivers some of the glucose and fat that you just ate to your body's fat deposits. Another is high-density lipoprotein, or HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol. It starts out as an empty protein packet sent out by the liver to gather up other cholesterols from the blood and artery walls and other cells. HDL then delivers the cholesterol back to the liver, or to places like the ovaries, testes, and adrenal glands, which use it to make steroid hormones. Alright, so now your body has put all the glucose and lipids and proteins where they need to go, and you can just coast into the post-absorptive state. But several hours later, even though your small intestine is still working on what's left of the buffet, your cells have been helping themselves to the remaining glucose in the blood, and eventually your blood sugar level will start to drop. Remember, your neurons are on an exclusive glucose meal plan, so they need sugar at the ready. And if your body senses an imbalance in blood sugar levels, it sounds the alarm. A decrease in glucose stimulates alpha cells in the pancreas to release insulin's nemesis, the hormone glucagon. It starts raising the blood sugar level by triggering the liver and adipose tissues to metabolize their fat and glycogen stores, thereby releasing fatty acids, glycerol, and glucose back into the blood. But if it's been a day or two since you've eaten, for some reason, and you've burned through both your blood glucose and your glycogen stores, and you don't have any sugars left to feed your brain, in that case, your body will launch into gluconeogenesis and convert fats and amino acids into glucose, so ATP synthesis can continue in your brain cells. This process is a sort of last-ditch effort by the body to protect the nervous system from the damaging effects of low blood sugar. Now, of course, this whole system has its flaws, and one of them is that the whole setup is almost entirely dependent on the proper release and reception of insulin. People with diabetes either don't produce enough insulin or have abnormal receptors for it, which is why they often have to inject a pharmaceutical version of the chemical after eating. Otherwise, their blood sugar levels will remain too high, and they'll start peeing out large amounts of glucose to try and balance the levels in the blood. The problem is, because glucose is being excreted and not stored, it's not available when the blood sugar starts to drop, so the body has to draw on fat and protein tissues for energy, which is one reason why sudden weight loss can be an early sign of diabetes. Whether you're diabetic or not, I think we can all agree that it is important to respect your blood sugar levels and remember to continue feeding the beast. But at brunch, just, use small plates. Try to keep the trips to the buffet line under 5 or so. Today, you learned how your body uses energy from food, including through cellular respiration, which converts glucose into ATP, glycogenesis, which converts it to glycogen, and lipogenesis, which converts it to triglycerides. And you also learned how insulin regulates your sugar levels. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions help make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everyone, everywhere. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
never get it out of my mind. Never. I think I could use a pill, maybe a Valium. I've never taken any of that stuff, but I sure could use something now.
When I'm trying to explain something to somebody and I just don't have all the words that I need, it's at the tip of your tongue, it's just out of reach. When I first started using Elevate, it was a revelation. At any given time, I can kind of challenge myself, and I really like that idea. Using my idle time productively.
Designed to improve the way you speak, write, listen, read, and more. Elevate, your personal brain trainer.
We've been spending a lot of time lately talking about eating and digesting and metabolizing food. And those are some of my favorite things in the world. It's been a really great time. But as with all good parties or brunch buffets, in the end, we're left with a mess. And I'm not talking about spilled beer and Dorito crumbs. I'm talking about toxic levels of garbage that need to be cleaned up before they kill you. In your body, a lot of the cleanup that comes after metabolism is handled by the liver, which plays a tremendous role in directing dead cells and leftover chemicals to the digestive and urinary systems. But your liver can't actually escort waste out of your person. Your lungs can lend a hand exhaling carbon dioxide, and of course your colon will eventually poop out unusable stuff and old cell parts. But much of your chemical waste still needs to be sorted and disposed of, so one system steps in to bat cleanup. And that is your urinary system. This system, and specifically your kidneys, does all sorts of important homeostatic stuff like regulating your water volume, ion salt concentrations, and pH levels, and influencing your red blood cell production and blood pressure. But its main purpose, what we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 lessons, is how it filters toxic leftovers from your blood, like nitrogenous waste made by metabolizing protein, and ferries it out of the body. And spoiler alert, this all involves the how and the why and the what of your pee. Now, you probably know that kidneys are filters, and you may imagine them as sieves that strain out the bad stuff, leaving it sitting like a hairball at the bottom of the bathtub. But that is, in fact, kind of the opposite of what you should be thinking. Most of what's in your blood is totally removed by the kidneys. Then, your body pulls back what it wants to hold on to before the rest is sent on a one-way trip to the bladder. It's kind of like this. You don't clean out your fridge by just taking out the rotten fruit and fuzzy leftovers. Instead, you gotta take everything out and put it on the counter and then sort through what goes back into the fridge and what goes in the trash. That's how your urinary system cleans you up, and it is really good at its job. So this morning, I decided to go the healthy route, and instead of eating my normal breakfast of nothing, I had a big 32-ounce protein smoothie. My digestive system did its thing, and all the protein was hydrolyzed into amino acids, which were absorbed by my blood and sent all over my body to build and repair cells. It's a beautiful thing, but not without consequence, because metabolizing nutrients, especially protein, makes a mess. You may remember that amino acids are unique in that they have nitrogen in their amine groups, and because we can't store amino acids, extra ones get processed into storable carbs or fats. The amine group isn't used in those storage molecules, so it's converted to NH3, or ammonia, which happens to be toxic. So the liver converts the ammonia into a less toxic compound, urea, which our kidneys filter out into our pee. Once out of the body, urea can degrade back into ammonia, which is why dirty pee-soaked toilets and cat litter boxes smell like ammonia. Now, this business of taking out the nitrogenous trash is one of the urinary system's biggest jobs. Its other major duty is to regulate the balance of salt and water in your blood, and both of these tasks are processed in the whole system of tubes that is your urinary system. So let's take a look at some basic pee-making anatomy. Your kidneys are a pair of dark red, fist-sized, bean-shaped organs that sit on each side of your spine against the posterior body wall. Kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they lie between the dorsal wall and the peritoneum, the membrane that surrounds the abdominal cavity, rather than inside the cavity itself, like your intestines and stomach do. Each kidney has 3 distinct layers, beginning with the outermost cortex. Beneath that is the the medulla, a set of cone-shaped masses of tissue that secrete urine into tiny sac-like tubules. And finally, the innermost layer is the renal pelvis, a funnel-shaped tube surrounded by smooth muscle that uses peristalsis to move urine out of the kidney into the ureter and into the bladder. Because the kidney's main job is to continuously filter blood, they end up seeing a lot of it. In fact, at any given moment, they hold over 20% of your total blood volume. Oxygenated blood enters the kidney through the large renal arteries, which deliver nearly a quarter of all blood pumped through the heart every minute. That means your kidneys filter about 120 to 140 liters of blood every day. As they enter the kidneys, renal arteries branch many times, ending in tons of little capillary groups. So a kidney isn't just one big filter. Instead, each one is made up of about 1 million twisty microscopic filtering units called nephrons. Structurally and functionally, nephrons are where the real business of blood processing, like pee making, begins, in 3 steps: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Each nephron consists of a round renal corpuscle that resides up in the cortex, followed by a long and winding renal tubule that loops around between the cortex and the medulla. The outer part of the corpuscle is a cup-shaped feature called the glomerular capsule, because inside it there's a whole tangle of capillaries called the glomerulus. That's from the Latin word for ball of yarn, which is pretty much what it looks like. And the endothelium of these capillaries is very porous, so they allow lots of fluid, waste products, ions, glucose, and amino acids to pass from the blood into the capsule. But they block out bigger molecules like blood cells and proteins, so they stay in the blood and exit through the peritubular capillaries, also known as the vasa recta. Now, all the stuff that gets squeezed out of the blood into the glomerulus is called filtrate, which is then sent along the elaborately twisting 3-centimeter long renal tubule. Even though it looks like just a tube, it actually has 3 major parts, some of which are permeable to certain substances but not others. First is the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, which is about as convoluted looking as its name suggests. Then the tube drops into a dramatic hairpin turn called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle, a term that I like better personally. And finally it ends in the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, which empties into a collecting duct. All this twisting might make the tubule look like super inefficient, but it actually serves an important purpose, as you might expect. Just like with your small intestines, the long, curly shape of the nephron provides more time and space for it to reabsorb whatever usable stuff it can. And this meandering path also allows the parts of the tubule that are toward the end to have an effect on processes that take place closer to the beginning as they pass each other. Because a lot of the stuff that winds up in the tube are valuable commodities, like ions and glucose and water, and we don't want to just pee all of them out if we can help it. So let's trace the whole process, starting at the top with the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. The walls here are made of cuboidal epithelial cells with big old mitochondria that make ATP to power pumps that pull lots of sodium ions from the filtrate using active transport. These cells also are covered in microvilli that increase their surface area and help reabsorb much of the good stuff from the filtrate back into the blood. The remaining filtrate passes from the PCT into the loop of Henle, which starts in the cortex, then dips into the medulla before coming back into the cortex. And the form of this loop is key to its function, because its primary task is to drive the reabsorption of water by creating a salt concentration gradient in the tissue of the medulla. It does this mainly by actively pumping out salts in the ascending limb. This creates some very salty interstitial fluid in the medulla, so when new filtrate comes down the descending loop in front of it, water passively flows out and into the super salty interstitial space. Since most of this water is picked up by the blood pretty quickly, the saltiness of the interstitial space doesn't get diluted, so it can keep drawing water out of the next batch of filtrate in the descending limb. Needless to say, this is super important, because if we peed out all the water that went into our kidneys, we would die of dehydration really quick. But even after all that, we are still only 2/3 of the way through the process. As we move out of the loop of Henle into the distal convoluted tubule and onto the collecting duct, the remaining filtrate is now officially urine. But there's one more component that we have to squeeze the most out of before we excrete the stuff: urea. Even though we think of urea as a waste product, just one more part of that protein shake that has to be dumped, the kidneys actually need it. They use it to ramp up the concentration gradient earlier in the process, making the medulla even saltier for the filtrate that's back there going through the ascending limbs. When the final steps, after the filtrate leaves the DCT, it enters the collecting duct, which runs back into the medulla. And while the salt passively draws even more water out of the collecting duct, some urea passively leaves the urine as well, making the medulla even more salty, and in turn more effective at drawing out water from the ascending limb a few steps back. So there's essentially a traveling pool of urea that escapes the urine, finds its way back into the loop of Henle, and then runs the whole course again back to the collecting duct, an ammonia-scented cycle called called urea recycling. Now all that's left is a kind of last call to selectively sneak out any extra waste like hydrogen, potassium, and certain organic acids and bases using active transport. This is called tubular secretion, and it transports only select kinds of waste that have already made their way into the blood that's in the paratubular capillaries ready to leave the kidneys. This step is kind of like emptying your pockets of any last wads of tissue or crumpled receipts as you're walking a bag of trash to the curb. And that's how your kidneys clean up the mess left over from the giant party that is you metabolizing food. So if you thought that your kidneys were just a kind of fine mesh that filtered out bad stuff, now you know that that's not true. If you thought your urinary system was basically a matter of water goes in, pee goes out, that's definitely not true. And if you thought we were done talking about your urine, that is also not true, because next time we're going to be learning how your body regulates what's absorbed and what's excreted, and we'll find out what can happen when that regulation goes awry. But for now, you learned the anatomy of your urinary system and how your kidneys filter metabolic waste and balance salt and water concentrations in the blood. Specifically, you learned how nephrons use glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion to reabsorb water and nutrients back into the blood and make urine with the leftovers. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions make Crash Course possible not only for themselves, but for everyone. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiFastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.